So my name is Deepankar Basu. Some of you might not know. I teach at UMass Amherst. I'm an economist by training. I primarily work in Marxian economics and development economics. So over the next 2 days, I'll try to convey the basic argument that is laid out in the 3 volumes of Capital. And I mean, there is a lot of controversy about many issues in Marxist political thought, in political economy. So I will try to steer clear of those controversies and just present the basic argument that I think Marx tried to present. And in the Q&A, we will try to have discussions about issues that you think should be part of our discussion. So to get started, let me deal with some introductory issues. So the first introductory issue that we should think about is how did Marx come to study political economy? So what was Marx's route to political economy? It is useful because during the phases of his study that really led him to the study of political economy, he developed certain ideas that remained with him as guiding ideas. And those ideas are important to keep in mind as we understand his overall logic. So most of you might know that Marx did his PhD in philosophy. And he wanted to be an academic, but it was pretty apparent that he could not get a position in the academy because of his radical political views. As a young student in Bonn and Berlin, he had been involved with radical democratic movements. So after finishing his PhD in 1842, he became a journalist. So he joined a newspaper called the Rhineland Gazette, and he initially wrote for it, and very soon he became its editor. So during the period 1842-43 is when, as an editor, he had to first encounter what he calls issues of material interest. So what were these issues? So he had to discuss the condition of the peasantry in the Moselle Valley. He had to take positions on the issue of protective tariffs and free trade. He had to engage in debate on theft of firewood. So firewood used to be collected by the peasants for a long time, and suddenly during that period, the people who owned the land suddenly said that collecting the firewood is a form of theft. So all these debates were going on, and as editor of a radical democratic newspaper, Marx suddenly realized that his previous training had not equipped him with a conceptual framework to understand these issues and to engage with them. So in the preface to the contribution to political economy, he very well lays out that it was during this period that when he encountered issues of material interest, his training in history and philosophy and jurisprudence and literature did not equip him with the framework to understand that. And that was the initial, what propelled him initially into the study of economics. So if we look at his phases of studies from 1842 onwards, we can break it up into at least 2 periods. So 1843 to 1848 is one period, and then there is a break, 1848, 49, and then there is the second phase. So this is the first phase, this is the interruption, and this is the second phase. So during the first phase, I think I'll use my So during this first phase, Marx studied three important strands of European thought. One was classical German philosophy, and essentially he engaged with the ideas of Hegel. The second area that he engaged with was English political economy. And the third was French socialism. So this is all written out in writings that Marx himself has written. And moreover, if we look at what he was reading during this period, it is more or less clear that these were the three foci of his study. And what emerged as a creative synthesis of these three strands is what later came to be called Marxism. So as Lenin pointed out, and since Lenin pointed that out, it is pretty standard to understand Marxism as a creative synthesis of these three strands of European thought. Now, what emerged from here were two key ideas that became guiding principles for him during his later periods of study. And those two ideas were the dialectical method and historical materialism, or a materialist conception of history. So let's briefly look at these two. These are huge topics, and one can go into a lot of discussion about each of those, but that's not what we want to do. We want to quickly go over these so as to pick out some of the issues that will be investigated by Marx later on, which really emerge from understanding these two issues. So the dialectical method roughly is a, is a way to understand the world which Marx borrowed from Hegel, and Hegel himself borrowed from the whole tradition of European philosophy coming all the way from the Greeks. The basic idea of the dialectical method is the assertion that any entity changes because of conflicting tendencies within it. And therefore, a method of studying any entity must do two things at the same time. One, it must study the key elements which comprise the system, the entity, which is a study of the structure of the system, which we can say is what gives its coherence over time. But at the same time, the dialectical method also tells us that to study any entity is also to understand why it changes. And to do that, what is necessary is to identify among the elements that comprise the system the key elements which stand in contradiction to each other. And by contradiction, we mean elements or tendencies which are on the one hand interdependent and on the other hand opposed to each other. So this type of relationship within an entity is what is a contradiction. And the key idea of the dialectical method is that any entity changes because of the primary, the principal contradictions hidden within it. Now this is what Marx really took away from his engagement with classical German philosophy. And then what he did, he wanted to apply it to the study of history and society. So with the dialectical method, he came to the study of history, and therefore he wanted to use the dialectical method to understand both the structure of society at a point in time and also identify the key reasons for long-term historical social change. Now, his study of history and French socialism had convinced Marx that the key elements which comprise a society which needs to be understood if we want to understand the structure of society is the material conditions of production and the relationships that emerge among big groups of people depending on their location in the production process. And those big groups of people is what he called social classes. So the fundamental social classes their conditions of existence, how they relate to each other, is the first task of a historical materialist understanding of society. So that gives us the first element, which is the understanding of the structure. The second element, of course, so understanding the conditions of existence of the fundamental social classes more or less comes from the study of political economy. So Adam Smith, Ricardo, and physiocrats, that whole tradition did provide a conceptual framework to understand the conditions of existence of the fundamental social classes. But where classical economy stopped was that it never wanted to ask the question or never question the existence of capitalism as such. And that is where Marx brings in the dialectical method and marries it to the insights from political economy to suggest that the reasons for change, long-term historical change, are going to be the contradictory relationships between fundamental social classes. So he takes political economy and pushes it forward. He takes the dialectical method and marries it to political economy. And therefore, the object of study of Marx was twofold. One, to understand the conditions of existence of the fundamental social classes, and two, to understand among those fundamental social classes which are the key classes and how their contradictory relationship play out. Now this is what really became the object of his study when he returned to his study again. So there was a brief period of interruption. In 1848, revolutionary movements broke all over Europe, and Marx, being a revolutionary, pushed back all his studies and immediately plunged into day-to-day politics. And during this period, he went back to Germany and engaged in day-to-day politics. But within a year or so, it was more or less clear that the revolutionary movement had failed. And he was driven from country to country, and finally he settled in England in 1850. Now, it is important to understand what lessons Marx drew from the experience of the revolutionary movement. So it was obvious to him and Engels that the revolutionary movement had failed for two reasons. One, because the movement had the middle classes in the leadership and not the working class. So the leadership was not with the working class. This was one key conclusion he drew from the experience of participating in those movements. And second, he realized that the working class did not have a well worked out conceptual framework to understand its own conditions of existence, its own location in society, and its historical mission. So it is this that he wanted to provide, a conceptual framework as a tool in the hands of the working class, which would take leadership when the next revolutionary upsurge happened. So this was the main motivation for why Marx plunged into the study of political economy once he got the opportunity to do so from 1850 onwards. And when he did so, he drew on the previous insights that he had reached in his first phase of his studies. And therefore, what he wanted to do, he says he wants to write a critique of political economy, by which he means an analysis of the conditions of existence of the fundamental social classes which comprise capitalism, and understand not only the conditions of existence but their contradiction. So the political economy, the critique of political economy that he wants to write, which would become a tool in the hands of the working class so that it could take leadership of the next round of revolutionary movement, would be a study of the laws of motions of capitalism, which means basically to understand the fundamental, the existence, the conditions of existence of the fundamental social classes. Now, Marx's study, the previous study, and this is pretty, and this he really took from the political economists, they had identified the three fundamental classes in capitalism. So there was capitalists, there was the workers, and there was the landlords. So when Marx started his study, there were categories which reflected each of these three. So his critique of political economy is really an elaboration of the three categories which reflect the conditions of existence of the three fundamental classes. So this one is capital, this is wage labor, and this you can say landed property. So his work on political economy becomes a way to elaborate these three conceptual categories, to work out its details and to see their relationship among each other. So that would be the main body of work that will become the 3 volumes of Capital. Now, let us also spend a little bit of time thinking about the structure of this work. So why did he organize into 3 volumes? Is there a logic behind it? And so on. So the first time we get an indication that Marx is planning a big work on the critique of political economy, and some idea of his structure is in 1857-58. So this was the period when he had completed a large part of his studies which he had started in England in early 1850s. And through his studies, his ideas were developing, and he first time gives an idea of what this book will be or what this work will be. So the first outline suggests that he will divide up the whole work into 6 books. There will be one book on capital, there will be one book on wage labor, there will be one book on landed property, there will be one book on, so I should see this. Yeah, one on state, one on the world market and crisis. Foreign trade, yeah. So one on the state, world market and crisis. And third one, foreign trade. Okay. Now, even in this initial period, Marx was clear that he would not have time to really deal with these books in any detail. So he mentions right here that he is really going to concentrate on these and really deal with this in a subsidiary manner, if at all. Over the next 5-6 years, Marx studied more and his ideas developed, and the final outline of the work comes out in 1865. So there are two major changes as we move from this first outline to this final outline. The first big change is that by 1865, Marx is clear that the whole work will be a work on capital. So the whole work is on capital. And the second change is that instead of dividing it up into 6 books, he will divide it up into 3 books. Book 1 will be on the process of production of capital. Book 2 will be on the process of circulation of capital. And book 3 is what he calls a general analysis of the whole capitalist system. So whole capitalist system. Now, why did he move from dividing up the work into a different book on capital, wage labor, landed property, from there to the whole work as a work on capital? Because by 1865, he realized that the key relationship which will capture the main contradiction in capitalist society is an analysis of capital. So it is all going to be an analysis of capital, and these will be absorbed within a study of capital. So book 1, which is a book which deals with the process of production of capital, will include a study of wage labor and, of course, a study of capital. Book 2, which deals with the circulation of capital, will deal with partly some issues which he had earlier thought would be a study of capital. And landed property will get absorbed into book 3. Now, there is a better way to see how this reorganization is happening if we accept the point which we are going to develop, that the key concept to understand when we want to study capital is the concept of surplus value. If we accept that proposition, then we can say that book 1 is about the generation of surplus value. So instead of saying that it is a process of production of capital, we can equivalently say the book 1 deals with the processes that deal with the generation of surplus value. Book 2 then will deal with, of course, the circulation of capital, but we can restate this as saying that book 2 will deal with the realization of surplus value. And what Marx means when he says that he wants to analyze the whole capitalist system and its reproduction can be restated as saying that book 3 deals with the distribution of surplus value. So then we we can see why these issues get absorbed in the way it does. Capital and wage labor will be essential to understand the generation of surplus value. Some part of capital will be essential to understand how that surplus value which is generated gets realized, or what are the conditions that can facilitate that realization or which can prevent that realization from happening. And thirdly, landed property comes into the issue of a discussion of distribution of surplus value, because the income that landed property will get, which is rent, is a fragment of the surplus value. But there are other fragments that Marx studied. So interest income is a fragment of surplus value. Industrial profit is a fragment of surplus value. Commercial profit is a fragment of surplus value. So all those will be studied, and landed property will be studied here as one group of people who derive their primary income from a redistribution of surplus value which they have not contributed anything towards producing. Now, in addition to this, there is another issue that this structure is about, and that is the issue of the level of abstraction. So Marx pitches his whole work in at least two different levels of abstraction. So book 1 and 2 are pitched on the level of what Marx calls capital in general. So by capital in general, he means that here he will ignore the fact that in any capitalist society, capital itself is divided into different units of capital which interact with each other through the competitive process. And there is an essential role for credit, the making of credit, availability of credit in the reproduction process. So those are the two things that he will abstract from when he deals with, or when he pitches his analysis at the level of capital in general. Which means that capital in general will just study the conditions of existence of the two poles of capital, which is the capitalist and the wage labor, as homogeneous blocks, as an aggregate entity. So the relationship between capital and wage labor at the aggregate level is what is going to be studied in volume 1 and volume 2. This will give us lot of insights about the capitalist system, but it is at a high level of abstraction. So in book 3, he then comes down to a lower level of abstraction which he calls many capitals. So in many capitals, those two abstractions that he had made are relaxed. So now when we come to book 3, there is the process of competition between capitalists. That is essentially, or that is one of the essential processes through which the distribution and redistribution of surplus value will happen. Moreover, there will be an essential role for credit, and there will be role for resource owners like landowners, and bargaining between resource owners and capitalists, and a further distribution or division of the surplus value into rent and other fragments of capital. So this is how the whole work is organized, and this is what the book deals with. It gives us an analysis of the capitalist system from a historical materialist perspective, and therefore it tries to understand the conditions of existence of the three fundamental classes. But to do that, the analysis is presented in a certain way. So it starts from a high level of abstraction, deals only with the relationship between capital and wage labor, and deals or brings out a lot of the implications of a capitalist system just by looking at that relationship. So that is what these two books are about. And then in book 3, he brings in competition and the process of bargaining between capitalists and different fractions of the ruling class. So by the end, what we get is a pretty comprehensive picture of the key groups, social groups in capitalism, how they derive their income, what are the relationships between them. One of the key things Marx points out at the very end of volume 3 is what he calls the Trinity Formula. So, neoclassical economics thinks of land, labor and capital as the three factors of production, and whatever income they derive, they think is justified because that is in some relationship to the contribution that factor made to the production process. Now that is a myth that has to be blown away by this analysis, because all the income streams really are fractions of surplus value. And in book 1, he will demonstrate that surplus value comes out of the exploitation of workers. And therefore, the myth that there are different factors of production and different income streams like profit and rent, interest, are somehow related to the contribution that factor makes to production is something that is completely alien to this way of thinking of the economy. Here, the first thing to realize is that surplus value gets generated, it gets realized, and then it gets distributed. So all the income streams we see in society is either wages, which is the income of the working class, or surplus value, which takes different forms. So that is one key insight that he highlights, that all the incomes that we see on the surface of capitalist society is really an expression of surplus value. And to understand that, we have to start from surplus value by abstracting from its form and looking at its content, at how it gets generated. So that's where we will start. Okay, so these are introductory comments, and we can maybe have a little bit of discussion, and then I can start with volume 1. If there are any questions, clarificatory questions, we can have that discussion. If there are none, I can immediately start volume 1. Yes.
So what happens to the state and foreign trade and things like this in this formula? You talked a little bit about how some elements are coming into the formula that you're talking about, but these three will come secondary, as it were. It does Marx's thinking shift on this question. Do they become just things that are enabling the distribution of surplus value? Do they all fit into book 3 and therefore are secondary in some sense? Or do they remain sort of primary, or is there a missing sort of whole area of theory which others have to develop in some sense? The other question was about some writing that exists which suggests that the 6-book formula was maintained, and that there's a missing book or missing set of volumes about where you can look at capital from the standpoint of labor. I forget who the author is.
Leibowitz. Yeah.
That's right. That there's a whole way of thinking about capital from labor, which Marx just didn't have the time to develop, but it's possible to develop this whole new system that looks at this process from the standpoint of workers, which would be fundamentally different from the standpoint of capitalists.
Okay. I mean, my understanding is that Marx kept the 6-book formula. He came to the 3-book formula discarding those 3 books because he did not have time to go into it. I mean, there is a footnote where we get this first outline in the Grundrisse. There is a footnote where he mentions that he is not going to have time to deal with book. So those were there. He shifted to book 1 because he had realized that studying capital was the first thing to understand capitalist society. Now those I don't think are secondary, but they have not been completed. So the discussion of the state is essential because the state does provide the conditions which are necessary for the generation of and realization and distribution of surplus value. So the political structure that is necessary for this process to continue is something that Marx did not work out, and I think that is something that needs to be. Trade is again an area that Marxist economics had not done much work on. I mean, there is some work by Anwar Sheikh, but it needs a lot of work. Again, crisis is another area where there is some work, but I think it can benefit from much more work. So I do think that those 6 volume work is something that needs to be completed, and Marx did not complete. And it will not fit into all those. I think those are something which will be in addition to that. One important thing is that this is really looking at a closed capitalist system. So trade, imperialism, those things are something that will have to be added to the analysis, and Marx certainly did not do that. The political underpinning of the capitalist system, that was the state. Again, Marx did not do that. And crisis tendencies, Marx had comments here and there, but he never got to write a systematic account of crisis. So I think those need to be worked out. Leibowitz, I'm not really very convinced about the fact that you can look at capital from different perspectives of labor and capital. I think this is how you need to understand capital if you want to understand what is capital, no matter what perspective you take. So the book, and moreover, the book on wage labor is not something that was left undone or something which was unwritten. That got absorbed into book 1. So there is a whole section on wage labor, the value of wage labor, determination of value of labor power in book 1. So I'm not really convinced about Leibovitz's argument. Yes.
My question is not exactly about the structure, but about this. The dialectical method used, because it is said that Marx turned Hegel on its head. So what does it exactly mean?
Yes, that's an important question, and I mean that would take a whole set of discussion. But roughly, I think what it means is the following. So the notion of dialectics comes from the Greeks. For the Greeks, dialectics was the process through which correct ideas emerged when there were conflicting ideas. Now Hegel borrowed that notion from the Greeks but went further. For Hegel, reality was dialectical. So reality had elements which were in contradiction to each other, and that was why reality had this kind of developmental process built into it. Now for Hegel, reality was, I mean, he was an idealist philosopher, so reality, the observed empirical reality, was an unfolding of the logic of the idea. What Marx did, I think, is he accepted this notion that reality is dialectical, but removed its metaphysical justification. And that is what it means to say that Marx turned Hegel on the head. So Hegel has a very complicated justification based on the structure of idea as to why reality is dialectical. It derives from ideas being dialectical. Now Marx accepted the idea that reality is dialectical, but he did not accept the metaphysical justification. So therefore, for Marx, historical progress was the result of dialectical processes built into social formations. And that's why he wanted to study the fundamental structure and its contradictions. So I think briefly that's what I understand by saying that Marx turned Hegel on its head. Yes.
What about the the volumes on theories of surplus value, would you consider them part of Capital, and or would that be a completely separate work?
Yeah, again, that's a great question. So some people consider the theories of surplus value as the fourth book of Capital, but I don't think that is correct. Theories of surplus value was really extended notes Marx made when he engaged with all the classical thinkers. So starting with Adam Smith, Ricardo, and all the rest. So it is really a kind of history of economic thought. It is not an analysis of the capitalist system. So it was something that was necessary to, for Marx to do to equip himself with the language and the conceptual structure of political economy. But he changed many things very drastically. So therefore, I would not consider it part of this. It is really a history of economic thought. And Marx read everybody in 3 or 4 languages that he knew who wrote anything sensible about political economy. But it was really a kind of engagement with those thinkers to draw out ideas which would be useful for him in his project, rather than one of the books of that project. Yeah.
Could you please elaborate a little on Marx's method itself in terms of it being a theoretical practice? Like, I mean, this fact, I mean, from where Althusser comes from in understanding that how Marx's method of doing itself was a theoretical practice in itself.
I mean, I don't have much to say about that. I think Marx was a scientist, and he was studying society using a scientific method. Of course, he had a dialectical approach because he accepted the basic idea that things change because of conflicting strands or tendencies within it. After that, he was just like any other scientist. He focused on society. He used the method of abstraction, just like scientists do. He used empirical data to validate his arguments, to test his ideas. So if that is what is theoretical practice, yes, it is. But I don't think there is anything more profound, at least I don't find it. So I don't have much to say on that. Yes.
Like there are many aspects in Grundrisse which some people say that which are not covered in the volumes of Capital, and like some people draw from fragments of machine or other parts. So in these 3 volumes of Capital, the structure, how much is incorporated from Grundrisse and what novelty is there in Grundrisse which is not captured in this volume? Do you think that Grundrisse as a separate work has its own merit?
My understanding is that Grundrisse is the notebooks, is the groundwork. I mean, that was the first draft of Capital. And it does follow this structure, and it is in Grundrisse that we get the first outline. Now, there are small things which Marx probably thought about at that point, but when he finished his studies and organized his thought, he did not find a place for them. So I think if you look at the work that Marx kind of completed from 1857 onwards, it is a progression towards these 3 books. Now, one important thing which I missed and I should mention is that Book 1 of Capital was published in 1867. Between 1857 and 1867, Marx was working out the material, and Marx had a lot of difficulty writing. So he had to be forced by Engels, and it was the crisis, that there was a economic crisis in England in 1857 which forced him to start writing and make his thoughts available to the public. So then he wrote a couple of things. So the Grundrisse was there, then contribution to the critique of political economy, which was the first chapter of Grundrisse, and then in 1861 to 63 he wrote 23 notebooks. those 23 notebooks, some of that Marx drew on to finalize book 1. But the whole project of book 1 and 2 and 3 is available in those notebooks. So before Marx finalized book 1 or volume 1, he had already worked out the whole thing. And that is important because if we just study book 1, we are getting an incomplete picture of Marx's economics. And even though Marx did not have the time and energy to finish book 2 and 3, and it was Engels who did it from the notes, it is important to stress that he had worked out the whole thing, and more or less the whole structure was present. So, I mean, to answer your question, I think the Grundrisse is an initial effort, and then you get a more detailed analysis of chapter 1 in contribution, and then in those notebooks, you get a better elaboration. So some scholars who are much more knowledgeable about these kinds of things think of those things as initial drafts of Capital. So yeah, something got left out. I mean, the fragments on machinery has been used a lot these days. Probably it was not all that important. Marx did not think, and that's why he left it out. So we should probably just go with what is available rather than think what Marx would have done. Now, it is also true that a lot of those notebooks had not been published, and it is only recently that they are being published. And as those notebooks are being published, we are getting to see even many more drafts of Capital. So it seems there were 4 drafts of Capital that Marx wrote, and this was the final one. So this is important to keep in mind, that he had worked out the whole thing before he came back to the notes to pull out volume 1. And therefore, the whole logic needs to be understood the whole thing, not only book 1. So unfortunately, over the last many decades, there has been lot less attention devoted to book 2 and 3, and most of the focus has been on book 1. I think that gives an incomplete picture, so we should look at the whole thing together, and that's why this is about all the 3 volumes. Yes?
This whole thing about the flow of money and money as an exchange, when was it that he actually develops on the flow of money and international trade in that sense? Because we know that he was a keen studier of the New York Stock Exchange and so on.
Right.
So how does that impact on his work here and vice versa? Because he was also a journalist, he used to write.
Right. So he did write, I mean, that interrupted his work. He had to write for the New York Tribune just to keep himself and his family alive. The notion of money will develop very early on in book 1. But the stock market is a much more fetishized form of wealth. So that will emerge only at a much lower level of abstraction. So stocks and dividends, those kinds of things will come here. And of course, Marx drew on his knowledge of stock markets around the world. He has a lot of illustrations that he uses from journalists and his own writings also.